All right, we are back, and so let's jump to the moon.
Hmm.
Okay, the one theory is that the moon is the satellite. Of course, it's the satellite of the Earth,
Hmm.
but it's actually an artificial object that
Hmm.
was placed there. And of course, David Icke talks about it. Many others talk about it. So, what is your thoughts and theories on that?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting concept. The idea that yes, it is our moon. There's no doubt about that. It is a moon, like any other moon. But there are some interesting things about it. I mean, when we have an eclipse, for example, and the moon blots out the sun. It's interesting that that if you look at the size of the moon compared to the size of the sun, obviously there's no comparison. But when you have a full eclipse, the moon just perfectly fits over the sun. I mean to an almost perfect degree, and that's just due to the distances, and the size. But when you compare the two together, and you have an eclipse, it's just so weird that it should fit perfectly, over the sun and just create this really eerie sort of 5-10 minutes sort of darkness. So you could make a case there that there was some sort of intervention or a reason for placing it where it is. Now, of course, if it was placed in Earth orbit, then that would suggest incredible technologies. The idea if you could literally manipulate sort of pre-existing object, in the skies and place it in the Earth's orbit. Now, of course, potentially that could cause major havoc. I mean, you only have to look at the Earth today. The moon, for example, impacts on tidal waves, that kind of thing. And of course, if the moon suddenly was not there tomorrow, I mean, it could cause havoc, on planet Earth. The gravitational pulls and so forth. So the moon, it isn't just a case of the moon's up there, and we see it every night. There are actually a lot of issues surrounding the moon that could impact on us, and if something ever hit the moon, a massive meteorite or something like that, potentially you could have a showering down of just massive amounts of moon rubble, if you like, impacting on the Earth. Now, there are some researchers who've suggested that the moon could be like a staging place, if you like, for extraterrestrials. And it is interesting that the moon doesn't orbit in the same way the Earth does. The Earth spins round, whereas the moon always shows one face to the Earth. We don't get to see the far side of the moon. And so, this has given rise to an interesting theory that perhaps that is deliberate. The idea that the reason why we don't get to see the the reason we don't get to see the far side of the moon is because maybe extraterrestrials are actively still there. And if that is the case, well, what better way to hide yourself than from a race of people, us, who cannot see the other side of the moon?
Exactly.
It make perfect sense. And when you add that to a lot of the really weird photographs that have been taken that do seem to show odd structures on the moon, which don't look like random pieces of rock and debris, and they actually do kind of look like the remains of sort of ancient artifacts, cities, installations, you name it. So I don't think the moon is itself something constructed, but the idea that it could have been utilized, in the same way that sailors out at sea, they have an aircraft carrier which they can land aircraft on, obviously. Maybe it's a similar thing. The moon was seen as the perfect vehicle, if you like, from which to launch missions to the Earth in the distant past. Maybe that's one of the reasons why ancient man was so revered the moon. It was seen as an important thing. It wasn't just, what's that big thing in the sky? It was worshipped. In some cultures actually did worship the moon. You have to wonder if there's a reason beyond the fact that it just looked eerie and silvery in the sky. Maybe ancient man knew that there was a connection between, quote, the gods and the moon itself.
And a theory I kind of subscribe to, or I don't know if it's mine, or I kind of just took bits and pieces from other people, but let's say that the moon was placed there. Maybe that is one of the reasons, or a lot of researchers, David Icke and many others, talk about the schism that happened amongst mankind. And also, mankind used to live up to 900 years, such as Methuselah, hundreds of years. So maybe then, in the ancient past, maybe the moon wasn't there yet. And what do you think about the gods when they came here? They want to have more control over mankind or the species here on Earth. And one reason, let's let them have a limited lifespan, and let's put this moon here in orbit because it pretty much controls everything. Tidal waves, the birds, hibernation, everything. And even a full moon creates craziness amongst people. Like on top of, it's just, I can keep naming things on the list with the moon and connection to life here on Earth. What is your thought on that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I know that research has been done by NASA and other scientific agencies with the idea of one day when we could achieve it, sort of going in further out into the solar system and literally sort of harvesting asteroids, that kind of thing, for precious minerals and who knows what. Now, of course, an asteroid is far smaller than the moon, but you've got to start somewhere. It could be the case, 50 years from now, we'll be mining asteroids and possibly, even manipulating where they are in the solar system, perhaps even bringing them closer to Earth. That wouldn't be impossible. That could be the first stage of us doing something very similar to actually maneuvering a moon. Now, if the moon was, brought into Earth's orbit, that in itself could have caused, calamitous weather issues. That something along those lines could have led to some of these legends.
Possibly even an ice age or something like that.
Yeah, something like an ice age or a massive worldwide flood. But perhaps the gods, saw it as it was worth the sacrifice for their more long-term agenda of what they had in store for us. But a lot of these ancient stories of worldwide cataclysms could well have been, caused by something like, if the moon really was placed in our orbit. I mean, if you look at Zecharia Sitchin's story of Nibiru coming close to the Earth and causing all sorts of havoc, well, you could substitute Nibiru coming close to the Earth against the moon actually being placed into the orbit. There's not that much difference, really. So maybe it wasn't Nibiru. Maybe it was the moon making its very first passing by the Earth. And it was only when all the storms, the floods, the hundreds of feet high tidal waves, earthquakes, volcanoes, the whole thing, possibly even polar tilts, when it all calmed down, the moon's still there, and the Earth then and the people start to rebuild. So
I didn't even think of that.
Yeah.
That could have been possibly the moon instead of Nibiru. I can't believe I didn't even think of that.
Well, the other angle, maybe, let's say hypothetically that the aliens themselves wanted to significantly reduce the human population on the planet for whatever reason. But maybe even they didn't have enough technology to, wipe out 90% of the population across the entire world. So what do? Well, maybe, you try and disrupt the planet. Maybe that was the reason why, if the moon was sort of placed in orbit, perhaps it was used as a weapon to try and disrupt the planet and the people itself. Because it is a fact that, if we didn't have a moon right now, and a moon, had a massive orbit and then finally did come into contact with us, just barely a couple of 100,000 miles away, it would cause massive damage. And arguably, you could weaponize the moon, and cause havoc down below. So, and although it sounds, controversial and incredible, I mean, people would say the same thing 200 years ago about, computers, televisions, aircraft, they would say there's just no way things like that could ever happen, and now they do. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't even think of something like that. But this is a two-part question. First off, do you think we went to the moon? And secondly, if we did, why haven't we been back?
Well, I do think we went to the moon. I'm not someone who thinks the whole moon program was hoaxed. I don't think that. But what I do think is that there are a lot of unanswered questions about certain aspects of the missions. Now, one of the things I know, there's an argument for both sides. Everybody's got an answer, which kind of they suggest that their answer's right. Somebody else's suggests they might be right as well. But if you look at some of the photographs, they are incredibly good. They're well lit. Some of them even seem to suggest, they're backlit. And when you put that into context, you have to wonder, are these just regular photographs where they got really lucky? When they've got these cameras essentially attached to them, and they've got to look down and try and pose the picture, and they came out really good. Now, that's not to criticise, the guy and say, well, they couldn't have done it. They could have done it. But when you put that together, with the issues people have talked about, the Van Allen belt, radiation, things like that, then, you have to wonder, wow, we really achieved something amazing. And maybe we really did just achieve something amazing.
Or is there something there that is, it scares the hell out of us and we don't want to go back?
Yeah, I actually think, as I said, I do think we took pictures, we got film footage. But when you hear these stories of, some of the astronauts coming out after retirement, etc., and not necessarily talking, obviously, about things on the moon, but actually going public and saying, well, I do believe in extraterrestrials, I think there's more going on. You sometimes have to wonder if that's sort of a signal somebody wants to say something without actually compromising perhaps a secrecy oath or something like that, and just have us think and muse upon that idea. So I do think there's good evidence and good data to suggest that far more was seen on the moon than we know about. There are a lot of these stories about astronauts seeing UFOs, strange lights in the sky as they're approaching the moon, things like this. And I think, if you look at the body of data, I think it does point to the fact that regardless of what happened, the most important thing is I don't think we've got the full story.